In the summer of 53 BC, the most powerful military force on Earth marched into the Syrian desert and never came back. Not because they ran out of food, not because they were ambushed in the night, not because their general was wounded or their supply lines were cut. They walked into the open desert under a blazing sun in perfect formation, carrying the most advanced military equipment of the ancient world, and they were destroyed. Systematically, methodically, by an enemy they had dismissed as barely worth fighting. Over 20,000 Roman soldiers died in a single afternoon. 10,000 more were marched into captivity so deep inside enemy territory that some of them were never heard from again. Some historians believe a small detachment of those captives eventually drifted as far east as China, where they may have lived and died without ever seeing Italy again. Their children growing up in a garrison on the edge of the Han dynasty, not quite knowing what they were. And the man who led them there, Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the three most powerful men in Rome, a man so wealthy he was said to own half the city, ended his life not in a blaze of glory, but face down in the sand, betrayed at a negotiating table by an enemy who understood something he never did. This is the story of the Battle of Carrhae. The day Rome bled in the desert. The day one man's ambition collided with military genius, and an entire civilization paid the price. And here is the thing that makes this story not just ancient history, but something painfully uncomfortably relevant. The decisions that led to Carrhae were not the decisions of a foolish man. They were the decisions of a brilliant man who wanted something so badly that he stopped being able to see clearly. That is a story as old as ambition itself, and as new as this morning's headlines. To understand why Crassus marched east in 53 BC, you need to understand who he was and what he was trying to prove. Marcus Licinius Crassus was by almost any measure the richest man in Rome. His wealth was not inherited. It was built deliberately and cleverly through a combination of business acumen, political connections, and methods that his contemporaries occasionally found distasteful. He owned silver mines in Spain. He owned vast stretches of Italian real estate, much of it purchased from desperate owners during the political prescriptions of the dictator Sulla sales conducted under duress, where Crassus was often the only buyer willing to make an offer. He owned an army of trained slaves, architects, silversmiths, secretaries, and readers who could be hired out to wealthy Roman households at considerable profit. At his peak, ancient sources suggest his personal fortune may have equaled the entire annual budget of the Roman state. But money in Rome was never quite enough in a culture that measured greatness in military victories and territorial conquest, where the pinnacle of public life was the triumph, the ceremonial procession through the streets of Rome, with a victorious general in a chariot and captive kings walking in chains behind him. Crassus had always lived in the shadow of men who had achieved what he had not, battlefield glory. His two partners in the political arrangement we now call the First Triumvirate, Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, were celebrated conquerors. Caesar was rewriting the map of Gaul, fighting battles that would become case studies in military textbooks 2,000 years later. Pompey had swept the Mediterranean of pirates in a campaign of breathtaking efficiency and had then marched east to reorganize the kingdoms of Asia Minor, bringing kings and princes to kneel before Rome with the ease of a man rearranging furniture. Crassus had crushed the slave rebellion of Spartacus. It was a genuine military achievement, and a necessary one. Spartacus had humiliated Rome for 2 years, defeating consular armies in the field, and Crassus had ended that particular national nightmare. But he was never allowed to fully enjoy it. Because Pompey had arrived from his Spanish campaign at exactly the wrong moment, encountered the last fleeing remnants of Spartacus's army, destroyed them, and then written to the Senate claiming that while Crassus had won the battle, he, Pompey, had torn out the very root of the war. The Senate gave Pompey a triumph. Crassus received the lesser honor of an ovation. The humiliation had never fully healed. Now Crassus was 60 years old. He was consul of Rome, and he had been given command of the Eastern legions with a mandate that excited him more than anything in his long, successful, deeply unfulfilling life, a war against Parthia. Parthia, the great empire that stretched from the Euphrates River to the edges of the Indian subcontinent, a civilization of ancient cities, silk roads, and sophisticated court culture. Rome and Parthia had been circling each other for decades, testing borders, exchanging ambassadors, occasionally clashing at the margins in proxy conflicts over the buffer kingdoms between them. A decisive war, a Roman conquest of Parthia, would give Crassus the legacy he craved. It would put his name beside Alexander the Great. It would finally permanently settle the question of whether Marcus Licinius Crassus was truly a man of history or merely a man of money. The numbers made it look reasonable. He commanded 7 veteran legions, roughly 35 to 40,000 heavy infantry supported by cavalry and auxiliaries. The Roman legion was the finest military instrument in the Western world, disciplined, adaptable, experienced, and backed by centuries of institutional knowledge about how to fight, how to march, how to build fortifications under fire, and how to win. 7 of them had conquered Gaul, pacified Spain, and humbled kings from Britain to Egypt. What he did not know, what he refused to listen to when people tried to tell him, was that Parthia had been preparing for exactly this moment. The kingdom of Parthia was not what Rome imagined it to be. Roman intelligence had painted the Parthians as a loosely organized confederation of Eastern kingdoms, wealthy, yes, perhaps culturally sophisticated, but militarily unsophisticated. Certainly no match for 7 Roman legions marching in formation with their iron shields and heavy javelins and centuries of tactical doctrine. This was wrong, catastrophically, fatally wrong. The Parthian military had evolved for generations on the vast open plains of the Near East terrain that favored mobility over formation, maneuver over brute force, and speed over mass. And it had produced 2 weapons that Roman tactical thinking had no real answer for. The first was the cataphract heavily armored cavalry, where both horse and rider were encased in overlapping metal scales covering them from head to hoof. They carried long lances, rode enormous battle horses bred specifically for the role, and were designed to smash through enemy formations like a moving wall of iron. Against infantry formations, the cataphract charge was devastating, a psychological weapon as much as a physical one, because the sight of a wall of armored horses bearing down at speed could break discipline before a lance was lowered. The second was the horse archer-like cavalry of extraordinary skill who had been trained since childhood in the nomadic tradition of mounted archery. They could gallop at full speed, stand in the stirrups, twist completely in the saddle, and loose accurate arrows backward at pursuing enemies while their horses continued to run. This was the famous Parthian shot, a technique so unexpected and so counterintuitive that it entered the language of every civilization that encountered it. We still use the phrase today, a parting shot, a final blow delivered while retreating that hits harder than expected. Together, these 2 types of cavalry formed a tactical system of elegant brutality. The cataphracts would press the Roman infantry formations, locking them in place, fixing their attention and their shields to the front. The horse archers would then circle the flanks and rain arrows onto the packed formations from sides and rear angles where Roman shields provided no protection. The Romans trained to advance and close with the enemy for hand-to-hand combat would find themselves unable to do either too pressed by cataphracts to advance too slow and heavily armed to catch the horse archers, and too densely packed to survive standing still under a constant arrow storm. The man who understood this system better than anyone in the ancient world, and who had refined it into a machine of lethal precision, was the Parthian commander sent to stop Crassus. His name was Surena. He was young, barely 30 years old when the battle was fought. He came from one of the great noble families of Parthia, the Surena clan, and he had already demonstrated military gifts that bordered on the extraordinary. In the dynastic struggles that preceded the current reign, Surena had personally led the campaign that restored King Orodes II to his throne. He had then commanded the siege of Seleucia, one of the largest cities in the ancient world, and taken it. By any measure before Carrhae, he was already one of the most accomplished military commanders of his generation. He was also, ancient sources note, with a certain ambivalence, exceptionally handsome, and traveled with a baggage train that reportedly stretched for miles, including his household, and what a Roman observer described as more luxury than most generals kept in their winter quarters. This apparent decadence was misleading. Beneath the surface display, Surena was a tactician of rare precision who had spent considerable time studying the Roman army's doctrine and designing a specific surgical response to it. Surena had approximately 10,000 men under his command when he moved to intercept the Roman force. Crassus had nearly 40,000. On paper, it was not even a contest. Surena did not need it to be a contest on paper. He needed it to be a specific kind of battle in a specific kind of terrain, and he needed to get Crassus into that terrain first. The Roman army crossed into Mesopotamia in the spring of 53 BC, moving through the upper Euphrates region with the confidence of a force that had never seriously doubted its own invincibility. Crassus was receiving intelligence about Parthian positions, but some of those reports were falsified by sources in Parthian pay. More critically, he was receiving advice from a local king named Ariamnes, a man who presented himself as a trusted ally, but was in fact working for Surena, who encouraged Crassus to abandon the safer river route along the Euphrates and cut directly across open desert to engage the enemy more quickly. The river route was slower. It would have kept the Roman flanks anchored and denied Parthian cavalry the open ground they needed to operate. The desert route was faster, and it was also, as Ariamnes knew, and Crassus did not, a killing ground perfectly suited to everything Surena had planned, a calculated deception of brilliant simplicity. And it worked. On the morning of May 6, 53 BC, the Roman scouts returned with urgent news. The Parthian army was very close. Crassus formed his legions into a defensive square, the standard Roman response to cavalry threat, designed to protect all flanks simultaneously, and they advanced across the flat plain near the town of Carrhae in what is today southeastern Turkey. The ground was everything Surena had hoped for. Flat, open, featureless, with no hills, no forest, no river bends, nothing that might give heavy infantry any advantage. Just an enormous sun-baked plain stretching to every horizon. Then the drums began. The Parthians used large kettle drums mounted on camels' instruments that produced a sound unlike anything in the Roman military experience. Not the crisp signals of Roman military drums, but a deep, resonant, almost physical thunder that seemed to come from everywhere at once and vibrated in the chest. Ancient sources describe it as terrifying in a way that transcended mere volume. It was psychologically designed to unsettle, to make the approaching enemy feel that the air itself was warning them away. The Roman formation held its discipline, but the drums were working. When the Parthian cataphracts finally appeared on the horizon, they had been covered in cloth and fabric to conceal the gleam of their armor during the approach. Now, at a signal, they threw off the coverings simultaneously. The desert air suddenly filled with the reflected light of thousands of metal scales. Ancient sources say the Romans had to shield their eyes. It was theatrical, deliberately, precisely theatrical, and it worked exactly as intended. The Roman formation absorbed a visible shock. Crassus ordered his son Publius, a brave, capable cavalry officer who had served with distinction under Julius Caesar in Gaul, to take a fast force and hit the Parthian left flank. Publius took 1,300 Gallic cavalry, 500 archers, and 8 infantry cohorts, roughly 5,000 men, and drove forward. The Parthians in front of him began to give ground, and then they ran. The Romans followed. This was the trap. This was the moment the entire Parthian battle plan had been built around. Publius had been drawn out, separated from the main body of the Roman army, pulled across open ground at speed, chasing an enemy that was retreating just fast enough to stay close. He was now far from the legions in open terrain, with cavalry that had been pushing hard. The Parthian horse archers stopped running, they turned, and they closed around Publius on every side. The cataphracts came from behind, cutting off any retreat. The horse archers circled the entire formation, maintaining devastating accuracy against the packed Roman infantry and cavalry. Publius had his men form a fighting square on a small rocky hill. There was nothing else to do. The Gallic horses, unarmored and ridden hard, went down first under the arrow storm. Then the infantry, locked together on the hillside, with shields raised, began to fall. Publius himself was badly wounded. He understood with the clarity that comes to a military man in an impossible situation that there would be no relief. He ordered his armor-bearer to hold his shield steady, and he fell on his own sword. His head was mounted on a lance, and the Parthians rode toward the main Roman formation and held it up for Crassus to see. Plutarch records what happened in the Roman lines at that moment with the precision of a man writing tragedy. Crassus was told. He rode forward. He looked at his son's head on the lance. He said to those around him, "This is my loss alone. Do not let it affect the army." And then he fell mostly silent. He was still present, still nominally in command. But the officers around him noted that he seemed to be somewhere else, somewhere none of them could reach. The battle continued through the long afternoon. The horse archers maintained their circling pattern, always in motion, always just outside hand-to-hand range, loosing arrows in an endless rhythm. Behind the Parthian lines, a supply train of 1,000 camels kept the archers replenished. Every time the volleys might have slackened, fresh ammunition arrived. The Romans tried charging in small groups. The horse archers simply outran them and resumed their positions. They tried the testudo formation shields locked overhead. The Parthians shifted their aim to the soldiers' unprotected legs. Every tactical response the Romans attempted had been anticipated. There was no answer in the Roman playbook for this specific set of problems. When darkness came, Crassus retreated with his survivors into the town of Carrhae. He had lost roughly 20,000 men dead in a single day. 4,000 more would die in the retreat. The survivors huddled inside the walls, trying to comprehend what had happened to them. After several days, negotiations were opened. Surena sent word that terms could be discussed, that there was a path forward that did not end in complete annihilation. Crassus's officers were deeply suspicious. His subordinate Cassius argued strenuously against going. But Crassus went. At the meeting point, violence broke out. Whether Surena ordered the attack or whether Roman panic triggered it, the sources do not fully agree. What they agree on is that Crassus was killed in the fighting. Ancient sources added the embellishment, almost certainly legend, but historically resonant, that Surena had molten gold poured into the dead man's mouth, a final commentary on the man who had spent his life accumulating wealth and died in a desert trying to trade it for glory. The Roman eagle standards, the aquilae, the sacred symbols of the legions, were captured. All 7 of them. They would not return to Roman soil for 33 years, recovered through diplomatic negotiation in the reign of Augustus, who considered their return important enough to commemorate on coins on monuments and in official verse. Horace wrote about it. Virgil invoked it. The shame of Carrhae had become part of the Roman national consciousness, a wound the empire carried for a generation. 10,000 prisoners were marched to Merv at the far eastern edge of the Parthian world. Most disappear from the historical record, but they do not disappear entirely. Ancient Chinese sources contain tantalizing references to settlements of unusual warriors with unfamiliar tactics near the western frontier of the Han dynasty. In 1955, a scholar named Homer Dubbs proposed that these might be descendants of the Carrhae prisoners. The evidence remains fragmentary and debated, but the possibility haunts the imagination. Roman legionnaires growing old in the shadow of the Gobi Desert, their grandchildren perhaps knowing nothing about the 7 hills or the eagle standards or the consul who had led them away. As for Surena, the man who had done all of this, his story ends in the oldest way executed by his own king, within months of his greatest victory. Orodes II had done the calculation that frightened kings have done across all of recorded history. A general who could destroy Rome's legions could certainly threaten a dynasty. Surena was 30 years old. He had saved Parthia. He had changed the trajectory of Roman history. He died at the order of the man he had saved, barely remembered in the records of the civilization he had humiliated, forgotten entirely in the civilization that had every reason to remember him. The Battle of Carrhae did not just kill one man and his army, it dissolved the political balance that had been holding Rome together. The First Triumvirate. The arrangement between Crassus Caesar and Pompey had functioned partly because Crassus held money and connections enough to mediate between 2 competing military ambitions. With him gone, that mediation ended. Within 5 years, Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Civil war consumed the Republic. Pompey was murdered on an Egyptian beach. And the structure of Roman government that had lasted for 4 centuries collapsed into something new, something that would call itself, eventually, an empire. The historians debate causation as they should. Carrhae was not the single cause of anything, but it was the stone that, falling into the water, sent ripples no one could predict, and some of those ripples are still spreading. The eastern border settled into a rough equilibrium that would hold with interruptions for 2 centuries. The Euphrates remained the informal boundary between Roman and Parthian power. Later emperors campaigned east of that line. Trajan briefly reached the Persian Gulf. But the easy confidence with which Crassus had looked east in 54 BC and seen only territory waiting to be taken never quite returned. The desert remembered. Crassus walked into the final trap, knowing on some level that it was a trap. His officers told him. The evidence was visible. But the alternative retreating home, arriving in Rome, not as the conqueror he had promised to be, but as the general who had lost 7 legions in the sand was something his sense of self could not accommodate. So he walked toward the thing that killed him, because the story he had constructed about himself demanded it. That is not a uniquely Roman failure. It is not even an ancient one. Leaders who cannot distinguish between the war they are fighting and the narrative they need to win. Generals who choose the dramatic over the wise. Men who mistake ambition for strategy and pay for the confusion with the lives of everyone around them. These figures recur through history with a persistence that suggests something deep and difficult about how power works and what it does to the people who hold it. Surena, by contrast, knew exactly what war was. It was not about glory or legacy or the need to be remembered. It was about achieving a specific objective with the resources available. He had 10,000 men. He used them with such precision that 40,000 Romans ceased to be an army by nightfall. And then he died at 30, unmourned by the king he had served, unremembered by the civilization whose legions he had broken. History has a strange and occasionally dark sense of justice. The Battle of Carrhae stands 2,000 years later as one of the most instructive military defeats ever recorded. It is studied in war colleges on multiple continents. It appears in books on strategy, asymmetric warfare, intelligence failure, and leadership under pressure. The lessons embedded in that one afternoon on the Syrian plain about the danger of underestimating an enemy, about the brittleness of confidence, untempered by information, about the way personal ambition can become the instrument of collective tragedy, have not aged a single day. We are still fighting versions of this battle, in different deserts, with different weapons, against different adversaries who understand the terrain better than we do, and who have studied our doctrine more carefully than we have studied theirs. And we are still occasionally being led by men who look at the horizon and see not the danger that is actually there, but the glory they have already decided is waiting. If this story of ancient sand and iron reached you today, if something in this 2,000-year-old disaster felt uncomfortably familiar or urgent or modern in ways you didn't expect, then subscribe to this channel. Because we are only beginning to dig into the chapters of history that the textbooks skip, the battles that decided the shape of the world, the decisions made in a single afternoon that are still somehow reverberating. The past is never as far away as it looks. We will see you in the next chapter.